Welcome to the debate. When you look at the architecture of a massive suspension bridge, there is this inherent paradox in its design.
Right.
We expect a bridge to be this pillar of absolute rigidity. I mean, it has to support thousands of tons of steel and concrete, not to mention, the endless stream of traffic. So the instinct is to build it as stiffly as possible.
Well, but let's not ignore the visual reality of that structure. You look at those massive steel cables and the concrete pylons, and the entire visual language just screams immovable stability.
Sure.
You don't drive across a bridge because you know it flexes. You drive across it because it projects an absolute, uncompromising strength.
It projects strength. Yeah, certainly. But the engineering reality beneath that projection is, well, it's entirely the opposite. If that bridge possessed absolute, uncompromising stiffness, it would just snap at the first sign of a severe storm.
Right. It needs the tension.
Exactly. The structural integrity actually comes from its ability to sway, to flex, and to absorb the kinetic energy of the wind. And that tension between flexibility and stability is really what we are dissecting today. We are examining the fundamental nature of executive leadership in highly volatile environments.
Yes.
And the critical question we are exploring is this. For experienced business leaders, is total executive certainty a strength, or is it a massive organizational liability?
It is a question that cuts straight to the bedrock of organizational behavior. And it's one that has taken on profound urgency in recent years.
It really has. And we are grounding our analysis today in the core themes presented in the 2026 text, The Intellectual Humility Edge, Leading Through Modern Uncertainty. And my position on this issue is unambiguous. In our current hyper-complex, AI-driven market, total executive certainty is a fatal liability. It creates dangerous echo chambers, cuts leaders off from reality, and ultimately destroys value.
Right, and my position offers a fundamentally different reading of organizational mechanics. Absolute certainty and unwavering conviction are the foundational strengths of strong leadership. Far from being a liability, projecting absolute certainty is a proven model. It's been established by decades of successful corporate culture, and it remains absolutely essential for executing complex, multi-year strategies.
Well, I want to outline exactly why the model you are defending just fractures under the weight of today's environment. The text we are examining argues that the era of the quote-unquote know-it-all executive is entirely dead.
Which is a bold claim.
It is, but we need to explain why that is. It isn't just because the world is moving faster. It is because of the underlying mechanics of a 2026 market landscape that's dictated by advanced predictive analytics and, exponential technological shifts.
Right.
Think about what an enterprise AI model actually does. It processes tens of thousands of real-time variables, supply chain microfrictions, granular consumer sentiment shifts, macroeconomic indicators, all simultaneously. Human cognition, no matter how experienced the CEO is, physically cannot weigh 50,000 variables at once to arrive at a perfectly optimized decision.
Sure, humans aren't supercomputers.
Right. Therefore, absolute certainty in this context isn't just arrogance, it is quite literally a mathematical impossibility.
But see, complexity doesn't negate the need for decisive leadership. If anything, it amplifies it. You are describing a market environment that is inherently chaotic and, quite frankly, overwhelming for the average employee.
It amplifies the need for truth, yes, but not manufactured decisiveness.
Well, let me finish the thought.
Oh, go ahead.
Because if the environment is that chaotic, the organization requires a decisive focal point to function. You have tens of thousands of employees, you have complex global supply chains, and very nervous shareholders.
Sure.
They are all looking to the top of the table for direction. The person occupying that seat must have the right answer, or at the very least, they must project that they have the right answer.
Even if they don't, because certainty isn't a leadership style, it's an organizational bottleneck.
How so?
When an experienced leader builds their professional identity around being the smartest person in the room, they actively damage their organization's sensory mechanisms. They force an entire company of, say, thousands of intelligent nodes to process vital survival information through a single flawed human brain.
I think flawed is a bit strong for highly experienced executives.
Well, Look at it like a pilot flying in instrument meteorological conditions. So flying through heavy fog where they can't see the horizon.
Okay.
Human physiology is inherently flawed in that environment. The pilot's inner ear can create spatial disorientation. It makes them absolutely certain they are flying level when they are actually in a banking dive.
Right. The graveyard spiral.
Exactly. Total executive certainty is the equivalent of that pilot trusting their gut and refusing to look at their altimeter. The navigation instruments, the data show the ground approaching, but the quote-unquote certain leader refuses to adjust the yoke.
I understand the appeal of the aviation metaphor. I really do. But let's look at the operational reality of running a massive multinational corporation.
Okay.
For decades, corporate culture correctly equated absolute certainty with strong leadership for a very specific structural reason. If the executive team constantly second-guesses themselves out loud, the entire organizational structure loses momentum.
But you don't think projecting doubt is just projecting honesty about the market's ambiguity?
In a philosophical seminar, perhaps, but in a boardroom, no. Projecting doubt is inherently perceived as lacking confidence. It is interpreted as weakness by the market, by institutional investors, and most dangerously by the internal workforce.
I don't know if I agree with that.
It is. It's about providing the solid ground that the rest of the company needs to stand on. Leaders must defend their strategies to the bitter end to maintain organizational stability and execution.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on what actually creates momentum. The framework presented in the text suggests that the rarest and most powerful competitive edge separating surviving companies from thriving ones today is intellectual humility.
Which sounds like a buzzword.
Well, we need to be very precise about this definition because the text explicitly states this is not about lacking confidence. Intellectual humility is an advanced cognitive ability. It is the capacity to completely separate your ego from your intellect.
But how does separating ego from intellect actually translate into an actionable business strategy? It sounds great in theory, but how does it execute?
It executes through the active, deliberate practice of seeking out dissenting opinions. An intellectually humble leader actively hunts for the friction of opposing views because they know their initial assumptions might be flawed.
I see.
And honestly, I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning you presented regarding unwavering certainty, because if we follow it to its logical conclusion, we hit a wall. How can a leader find the truth quickly if their absolute certainty prevents them from listening to anyone else in the room who might be holding a critical piece of data?
Well, I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that constant friction equals truth. Let me tell you why. You're assuming that constantly seeking out dissenting opinions leads to a faster discovery of the correct path.
Usually, yes.
In practice, constantly inviting friction creates organizational paralysis. I seriously question the stability of a company where the leader is in a perpetual state of seeking opposing views. Let's ground this in a concrete 2026 scenario.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine a legacy global logistics company transitioning to fully autonomous trucking. The CEO commits $2 billion to an internally developed AI routing system. This is a massive multi-year transformation.
A perfect example.
Right. Now, 6 months into the integration, the system is buggy. Deliveries are delayed. Middle managers are complaining that an off-the-shelf vendor would have been easier.
Which happens all the time.
Exactly. Now, if the CEO is practicing what you call intellectual humility, they are constantly inviting these middle managers to debate the strategy. If middle management knows the CEO is constantly seeking opposing views, they will hesitate to fully commit their departmental resources to the current strategy, anticipating a pivot. They will drag their feet. That hesitation, that lack of unified execution is what actually kills the initiative.
But wait, that hesitation is only fatal if the original strategy was correct. What if the internal AI system actually is functionally inferior to the off-the-shelf vendor?
Even if it is, the pivot.
No, in a highly volatile market, that so-called hesitation from middle management is actually the organization trying to save itself from a $2 billion sunk cost fallacy.
I disagree.
Intellectual humility allows the leader to look at the altimeter and recognize that the strategy is failing before the damage becomes catastrophic.
I come at it from a different way.
Every transformative business initiative faces a trough of disillusionment, a period where the initial data looks terrible, where the team is exhausted, and where the critics are very loud.
Sure, the dip.
Right. If a leader lacks absolute certainty in their vision, they will abandon the strategy at the very first sign of friction. We have to look at how experienced leaders reach that top table in the first place. They don't get there by being perpetually unsure.
Well, no one is saying they are unsure.
They reach the executive suite because they possess a track record of formulating winning strategies and having the sheer force of will to push them through institutional resistance.
But relying purely on that past track record is exactly the trap the text highlights.
What you in the text are calling ego, I would argue, is actually the necessary fortitude to see a strategy through that trough of disillusionment. The accolades of the past are proof of a leader's instinct and capability. They are pattern recognition earned over decades.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The fortitude to push through temporary operational setbacks is absolutely necessary. Nobody is arguing a leader should quit when things get hard.
Right.
But the market in 2026 does not care about your past accolades. It has zero memory of your previous successes. It only rewards rapid adaptability to the current reality.
So you don't think past success, that earned pattern recognition, is a reliable indicator of future capability?
It can be an indicator of capability, sure, but it can also become a cognitive straitjacket. When a leader's identity is entirely wrapped up in their past wins, their ego becomes intrinsically tied to the specific frameworks that got them those wins.
I see what you're saying, but
The problem is that the half-life of a successful business framework is shorter today than at any point in history. When the market shifts fundamentally, defending obsolete ideas just to save face isn't fortitude, it's organizational sabotage.
sabotage is a strong word.
Well, it is. The leader's job is not to be right all the time. Their job is to find the truth, regardless of the source. If an entry-level data scientist spots a fatal flaw in that logistics CEO's flagship AI strategy, the CEO's 30 years of past accolades do not rewrite the math.
Certainly the math is the math. If the algorithm is definitively broken, a leader must pivot. But leadership isn't just about acknowledging mathematical realities. It's about managing human psychology at scale.
Which is exactly why the mechanics of what the text calls unlearning are so vital here. If you're listening to this and thinking, well, a CEO who constantly unlearns just sounds incredibly weak and wishy-washy, I get it.
It does sound that way.
It runs counter to every movie we've ever seen about corporate titans. But we have to distinguish between tactical unlearning and foundational weakness. Think about how a machine learning algorithm functions.
Okay.
When it is fed new, contradictory data, it updates its weights and biases, and that's just a technical way of saying it adjusts the underlying mathematical assumptions it uses to make decisions.
Right, it recalibrates.
Yes, it doesn't stubbornly hold on to its previous assumptions out of pride. It updates. It unlearns the obsolete pattern and forms a new one. Experienced business leaders must cultivate that exact same cognitive mechanism.
That's a compelling technological metaphor. But have you considered the fundamental contradiction in applying machine learning mechanics to human organizations?
In what sense?
Human beings are not algorithms, and massive organizations are not sterile data laboratories. The text claims that the most successful leaders operate with, quote, strong convictions, but they hold them loosely.
Exactly.
I find that to be a profound paradox that is nearly impossible to operationalize without causing absolute chaos.
How is it impossible? It's simply the scientific method applied to enterprise management. You form a strong hypothesis, act on it with full resources, but discard it the moment the empirical evidence disproves it.
It's impossible because of the psychological toll it takes on the workforce. How exactly does an executive operate with strong convictions if they hold them so loosely that they are constantly unlearning them?
Well, if you stand up at an all-hands meeting and tell your workforce, I am absolutely certain this is our path, until tomorrow when I might aggressively unlearn it based on new data, you are going to create a deeply anxious corporate culture.
I don't think they'd say it quite like that.
The rank and file will suffer from change fatigue. They will stop believing in the leadership's vision because they know the vision is written in pencil.
That assumes the workforce only respects infallibility, though. Let's look at what strong convictions loosely held actually looks like in practice, because it addresses that exact anxiety.
Go on.
The conviction isn't necessarily about the specific tactical path. The conviction is about the ultimate goal and the commitment to reality. If the goal is to dominate the autonomous logistics sector, the leader can be fiercely convicted about that destination.
Right. But the path to get there, whether it's an internal AI build or an external vendor, that must be held loosely. If new data shows that the internal product line is fundamentally misaligned with the technology's evolution, unlearning that product strategy isn't showing weakness to the workforce. It's showing competence.
But doesn't that constant pivoting damage the leader's credibility over time? If a leader has to frequently stand up and say, I was wrong about this major initiative, why should the board or the employees trust them the next time they ask for $1 billion?
Because they know the leader values reality more than their own vanity. According to the framework we're discussing, making the phrase, I was wrong, your ultimate strategic weapon is actually the key to surviving in this landscape.
A weapon?
Yes. When a leader says, I was wrong, they instantly destroy the organizational echo chamber. They signal to the entire company that the truth is the highest priority. It grants psychological permission for everyone else in the company to surface bad news quickly, rather than hiding it to protect the boss's ego.
I'm not convinced that I was wrong functions as a strategic weapon. I think, more often than not, it is a vulnerability disguised as enlightenment.
Really?
Yes, psychological safety is important. I am not advocating for a culture of fear where bad news is buried, but an executive who has to constantly apologize for strategic miscalculations is an executive who is failing to read the market accurately in the first place.
But nobody can read a hyper-complex market perfectly.
But you are constantly unlearning. You are perpetually reacting. You aren't leading the market. You are being dragged behind it. Certainty backed by deep experience allows a leader to shape the market rather than just respond to it.
But shaping the market requires an accurate map of the terrain. If your certainty blinds you to the fact that the terrain has fundamentally altered, you aren't shaping anything. You're just driving that global logistics company into bankruptcy.
Right.
The hyper-complex nature of 2026 means that the terrain is always altering. Intellectual humility is the radar system that allows the leader to see those alterations in real time.
And certainty is the engine that actually moves the ship forward through the storm. If we pull back to look at the historical timeline, the leaders who actually build enduring organizations share one defining trait, which brings me to my closing argument on this debate.
Please.
My stance remains that absolute certainty is the bedrock of executive strength. The person at the top must defend their strategies, and as a rule, they must project unwavering confidence.
Right.
The traditional model of corporate culture, where the leader is the definitive, immovable focal point, survived and thrived for decades precisely because it works. It aligns complex human organizations, it drives massive execution, and it maintains stability through inevitable turbulence. What the text celebrates as intellectual humility and rapid unlearning, I see as a profound risk when misapplied. Constant pivoting, masquerading as humility, risks projecting weakness and indecision. When the market is chaotic, employees and shareholders do not want a philosopher who is constantly deconstructing their own strategies in public. They want a resolute commander who can execute a vision with absolute conviction.
And my closing argument rests on the reality of the technological and economic environment we are actually operating in today. The 2026 landscape is profoundly unforgiving to those who operate on the outdated assumption that one human brain can hold all the answers.
The ultimate strategic weapon today is indeed the phrase, I was wrong, because it optimizes the organization for speed and truth. As the text outlines, surviving companies are separated from thriving ones by leaders who actively invite friction. They separate their intellect from their ego, and they prioritize the rapid discovery of empirical truth over the protection of their self-image.
Yeah, in an era defined by exponential change and overwhelming data, absolute certainty is a rigid, brittle liability. Rapid adaptability, fueled by intellectual humility, is the true enduring strength of the modern executive.
It is undeniably a profound balancing act. The tension between maintaining unwavering conviction and practicing intellectual humility is something every executive must navigate daily.
Absolutely. The mechanics of leadership in modern market complexities are intricate, and there is certainly much more to explore in this material regarding how these exact dynamics play out across different global industries.
There is always more nuance to uncover when we examine the intersection of human psychology and corporate strategy.
Indeed. But as we sign off, I keep coming back to that pilot flying through the heavy fog. The question remains, when the visibility drops to zero and the navigation instruments flash a warning, does the true strength of a leader lie in gripping the yoke with absolute unyielding certainty, or in having the humility to read the data and change course?
That is a question every leader will ultimately have to answer for themselves when the pressure is on.
Thank you for joining us for The Debate.